13 May 1948, late morning, somewhere above the clouds south of Paris. In the narrow cabin of a de Havilland Dove, Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy folds a piece of hotel stationery along a neat crease and slips it back into her leather bag. The note, half finished, is addressed to her father in Palm Beach. Outside, the engines drone. Inside, light falls in strips across her gloved hands and the pearls at her throat. Opposite her sits Peter Wentworth Fitzwilliam, 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, leafing through papers about his pending divorce and their future plans, documents that, like her letter, will never be posted. Just 10 years earlier, London society columns had called her the debutante of 1938, the American ambassador's sparkling daughter at 14 Prince's Gate. Now, at 28, she flies toward the French Riviera to negotiate a forbidden second marriage with a married Protestant aristocrat. She smooths the folded page one last time, as if good manners could still steady a life that has slipped beyond acceptable form. The gesture is flawless. The cost will be absolute. On a winter morning in late February 1920, at 83 Beale Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, Kathleen Agnes Kennedy is born into a house already organized around ambition. She arrives as the fourth child of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, joining older siblings Joseph Jr., John, and Rosemary in a nursery where expectations are established early and enforced consistently. The Beale Street house, now preserved as a National Historic Site, was a modest wood frame structure by the standards to which the Kennedys aspired. 3 stories, 9 rooms, respectable but not grand. Joseph Sr., then 31, was building his fortune through banking and stock speculation, while Rose, daughter of Boston Mayor John "Honey" Fitzgerald, brought political connections and Irish Catholic social standing to the marriage. By the time Kathleen is old enough to remember, the family has already begun its upward trajectory. Photographs from the early 1920s show the Kennedy children arranged on Cape Cod beaches and in formal parlors, Kathleen among them in white dresses with large bows, her expression even more animated than her siblings. Family members will later recall that she earned her nickname Kick for her irrepressible energy, the way she bounced rather than walked, the vitality that seemed to crackle around her. In 1927, when Kathleen was 7, Joseph moved the family to Bronxville, New York, an affluent Westchester suburb where the houses are larger and the neighbors more prominent. The Kennedys purchase a sprawling colonial at the corner of Pondfield and Midland, with enough bedrooms for a family that will eventually number 9 children. Here, Kathleen attends Riverdale Country School, learning Latin verbs and penmanship, alongside the children of New York professionals and industrialists. School records from Riverdale, preserved in the institution's archives, show Kathleen as a lively student, not the most academically gifted but socially adept, popular with classmates, comfortable in group settings. Early photographs show her in the school's regulation pleated skirts and midi blouses, her hair bobbed in the fashion of the late 1920s, her smile already the easy, unguarded expression that will later charm London drawing rooms. But even in these early years, the training in social performance begins. Rose Kennedy, raised in Boston's political culture, where appearance and propriety were weapons in the constant battle for status, insists that each child master the rituals of upper-class courtesy. After birthday parties and holiday visits, thank you notes must be written promptly, in careful script, with proper attention to tone and phrasing. On a rainy afternoon in the autumn of 1930, in the Bronxville dining room, with its damask curtains and polished mahogany table, 10-year-old Kathleen leans over thick cream stationery embossed with the family's Bronxville address. Her mother sits beside her, dictating phrases that Kathleen copies in her developing hand. "Dear Aunt Margaret, thank you so much for the lovely birthday gift." The scratch of the fountain pen against expensive paper, the starch of her cuffs brushing the table edge, the careful way she signs simply, "Kathleen," in the flourishing script Rose has taught her. All of it turns courtesy into repetition, gratitude into formula. The letters are not expressions of feeling, but exercises in form, training in how to translate emotion into acceptable language. Rose reviews each note before it is sealed, correcting not just spelling and grammar, but tone, not too effusive, not too plain, exactly the right balance of warmth and restraint. A thank you note, in Rose's view, is a test of character and breeding, a small but crucial performance that signals one's place in the social order. The narrator observes that from the beginning, for Kathleen as for all Kennedy children, writing letters is not self-expression but training, learning to perform feelings in ways that advance family interests, to package genuine affection in the vocabulary of social strategy. The girl who learns to write thank you on command will later use the same neat script to defend a love her family cannot forgive. By the early 1930s, Kathleen's education extended beyond New York. After graduating from Riverdale, she attended the Norton Convent of the Sacred Heart in Norton, Connecticut, a Catholic boarding school known for educating daughters of wealthy Irish Catholic families who aspired to acceptance in America's Protestant-dominated elite. The Sacred Heart convent system, established by French nuns in the early 19th century, operated schools across America and Europe, all following the same philosophy: to produce young women who combined deep Catholic piety with the social graces necessary to move in the highest circles. The curriculum balanced religious instruction, daily mass, frequent confession, theology classes, with training in French, music, deportment, and the subtle arts of conversation and correspondence. At Norriton, housed in a Gothic Revival building overlooking Long Island Sound, Kathleen's days follow the rigid schedule common to all Sacred Heart schools. Rising at 6 for morning prayers, mass before breakfast, academic classes in the morning, needlework and music in the afternoon, evening rosary, lights out at 9. The bells that mark these transitions echo through stone corridors, ordering every hour, leaving no space unaccounted for. But Kathleen, according to school records and later reminiscences from classmates, thrives within this structure rather than chafing against it. She is remembered as gregarious, funny, irreverent in permitted ways, able to joke with the nuns without crossing into disrespect, to lead her classmates in mischief that stops just short of serious transgression. Letters home from this period, preserved in Kennedy family collections, mention pranks, friendships, small rebellions that suggest spirit rather than actual defiance. In 1933, at 13, she was sent to the Holy Child Convent in Neuilly-sur-Seine, just outside Paris. This is a significant elevation in educational prestige. The Neuilly Convent educates daughters of European aristocracy and American families with serious social ambitions. Here, Kathleen is immersed in French language and culture, attending classes with girls who speak 3 or 4 languages fluently and move between continental capitals with casual familiarity. The convent building in Neuilly is elegant in the French style: high-ceiling rooms with tall windows, parquet floors, a chapel with stained glass that casts colored light across white stone. The corridors smell of furniture polish and incense. French phrases echo as girls recite passages from Racine and Molière. Outside the convent walls, Paris in the mid-1930s is a city of boulevards and cafes, of art galleries and haute couture, but the girls see little of it. Their Paris is the controlled version offered on chaperoned outings to museums and churches. School records from such institutions, preserved in various archives, reveal a curriculum designed less for intellectual development than for social preparation. Girls study French and Italian, practice piano and watercolor painting, learn the protocols of formal dinner service, and the complex etiquette of calling cards and written invitations. The underlying assumption is that these skills matter more than mathematics or science, because these girls will not work, they will marry, and their value will lie in their ability to manage households, host political dinners, and represent their husbands gracefully in public. Kathleen writes home regularly, her letters signed now with the brisk, affectionate kick that reflects her growing confidence and personal style. The letters, some of which have appeared at auction, at Christie's, and other houses, describe French food, classmates from titled families, excursions to Versailles and Notre Dame. The tone is light, observant, already showing the wit that will later make her a favorite in London society. Every evening after supper, In the quiet study period before evening prayers, she sits at a sloping wooden desk in the dormitory, writing letters to her brothers in America. Outside, Parisian traffic murmurs in the gathering dusk. Inside, candlelight flickers over ink bottles and the rosary beads that every Sacred Heart girl carries. The act of writing, to Jack at Choate, to Joe Jr. at Harvard, becomes a way of maintaining connection across the Atlantic, of performing the role of devoted sister, even as her world expands far beyond theirs. The narrator reflects that this world is opening: Europe, languages, sophisticated friendships, but always framed by institutions designed to return her to family expectations, polished rather than altered, refined but not fundamentally changed. The convents are not prisons, but neither are they invitations to independence. They are finishing schools in the truest sense, places where rough edges are smoothed, where personality is shaped into acceptable form, where girls learn to move through elite spaces without disrupting the order those spaces maintain. By the time Kathleen returns to America at 17, she speaks French fluently, knows how to navigate European social customs, and has absorbed the lesson that will both serve and constrain her for the rest of her life: how to charm in multiple languages while hiding disagreement in all of them. In early 1938, when Joseph P. Kennedy was appointed United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James's, a position he had actively sought as validation of his wealth and political influence, the entire Kennedy family relocated to London. For Joseph, the ambassadorship represents arrival at the pinnacle of American society. For his children, particularly Kathleen, it opens doors that might otherwise have remained closed to an Irish Catholic family from Boston. The embassy residence at 14 Prince's Gate, overlooking Hyde Park and Knightsbridge, is a Georgian townhouse of considerable elegance: high-ceilinged reception rooms, a grand staircase, windows that flood the interior with soft London light filtered through plane trees. The house comes fully staffed with English servants who manage the complex choreography of diplomatic entertaining, footmen in livery, cooks who understand the intricacies of formal dinner service, maids who maintain the endless polishing and cleaning required to keep such a house presentable. At 18, Kathleen enters this world already prepared by years of convent education and family training. But even she must learn the specific codes of British aristocratic society, which operate according to rules more ancient and more rigid than anything she has encountered in America or Paris. The British class system is not merely about money — the Kennedys have plenty of that — but about lineage, land, and a complex web of familial connections that stretch back centuries. Rose immediately undertakes the presentation of her daughters into London society, understanding that acceptance here will confer status unattainable in Boston or New York. Kathleen is enrolled at Queen's College on Harley Street, Britain's first institution for the higher education of women, founded in 1848. Unlike the Sacred Heart convents, Queen's College offers serious academic courses: literature, history, mathematics, though for most students from elite families, including Kathleen, the institution functions less as preparation for professional life than as a respectable way to spend time before marriage. On weekday mornings during the spring and summer of 1938, Kathleen walks from Prince's Gate through the streets of Mayfair to her classes, past Georgian townhouses with their black iron railings and pristine white facades, past Rolls-Royces and Austin taxis, through a city that is simultaneously ancient and the center of a vast empire. The sensory details of London in this period, the particular quality of light through perpetual clouds, the smell of coal fires, the sound of church bells over traffic, become the permanent backdrop of her memories. But more important than her formal education are the afternoons and evenings of social performance. Kathleen's scrapbook from 1938-1940, meticulously preserved at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, is a self-curated portrait of a young woman perfectly at ease in London drawing rooms. The pages are filled with invitations embossed with aristocratic crests, programs from charity balls and theatrical performances, newspaper clippings from society columns, photographs of her with Nancy Astor and other prominent hostesses. The British press, always fascinated by American wealth and particularly interested in the ambassador's attractive family, dubs her the debutante of 1938. Society columns describe her as vivacious, charming, unpretentious, qualities that set her apart in a culture where aristocratic women are often trained in hauteur and emotional reserve. Her American ease, her ready laugh, her genuine interest in people become her signature, the characteristics that make her popular in circles where other Americans might be merely tolerated. On a March evening in 1938, the drawing rooms at Prince's Gate are filled with guests for a reception, cabinet ministers, peers, diplomats, journalists, all the overlapping networks of power that constitute London society. A string quartet plays Vivaldi near the tall windows. Waiters circulate with champagne and canapes. The gaslight from the street lamps outside mingles with the candlelight inside, casting everything in a soft, flattering glow. Kathleen stands near a window in a pale evening gown, holding her dance card, a small booklet with a silk cord, each page marked with a line for a partner's name. She fills it quickly with penciled names in her quick slanting hand. Lord this, the Honorable that, young men from families whose titles appear in Debrett's and whose estates dot the English countryside. Later, long after the last guests have departed and the servants have cleared the rooms, she sits at a small writing desk in her bedroom and begins another note, this one thanking a hostess for a perfectly arranged dinner party she attended the previous week. The thank you note, written on embassy stationery with the American seal embossed at the top, flows easily now. The pen that once laboriously traced phrases dictated by her mother now races confidently across the page in her own voice, but it still serves the same essential purpose: to smooth social surfaces, to maintain the networks of obligation and reciprocity that constitute elite society, to ensure that every connection is acknowledged and reinforced. The narrator observes that somewhere, among the names penciled into that dance card, among the young aristocrats she meets at balls and house parties during the summer of 1938, is William John Robert Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, heir to the 10th Duke of Devonshire. Billy, as he is universally known, is exactly the kind of match that might once have seemed impossibly grand for an Irish Catholic American girl. But in the cosmopolitan world of late 1930s London, where American wealth has long since purchased entree into the highest circles, such an alliance becomes imaginable. That the match will offer both a path into the very heart of British nobility and the beginning of Kathleen's undoing is not yet apparent on that March evening, when everything still seems possible, and the coming war remains just a gathering shadow on the diplomatic horizon. By the spring and summer of 1938, Kathleen's life settled into the demanding rhythm of the London social season. Her days are divided between morning lectures at Queen's College, where she studies literature and history with varying degrees of attention, and the elaborate afternoon and evening rituals of aristocratic sociability. The London season, a carefully choreographed series of events from April through August, exists primarily as a marriage market for the upper classes. Young women are presented at court, attend balls and house parties, go to Ascot and Henley, all while being assessed by mothers of eligible sons and by the young men themselves. The ostensible purpose is social pleasure. The actual function is dynastic negotiation. Kathleen's scrapbook captures this world in all its organized frivolity. Invitations to dances at Londonderry House and Dorchester House, programs from Ascot race meetings, photographs of weekends at country estates where tennis and riding fill the days while dinners and dancing fill the nights. Each event is documented with the enthusiasm of someone genuinely delighted by her circumstances. Pressed flowers from bouquets, handwritten notes from new friends, ticket stubs from theater performances. On weekday afternoons when she has no classes, she plays tennis at private clubs in Kensington, the hollow thunk of balls on grass courts mixing with polite laughter and the clink of teacups. Or she walks through Hyde Park with new friends from aristocratic families. Lady Astor's daughter, daughters of earls and viscounts, young women who take for granted a world Kathleen is still learning to navigate. At night, in her bedroom at Prince's Gate, with its view over the dark expanse of Hyde Park, she writes letters to her brother Jack, now at Harvard. These letters, some of which survive in the Kennedy papers, reveal a deeper engagement than the scrapbook suggests. She describes her London friends with affection and wit, mentions the political tensions mounting as Hitler annexes Austria and threatens Czechoslovakia, and refers with increasing frequency to Billy, William Cavendish, whom she has met at multiple social events and who has begun to single her out for attention. The Cavendish family represents the apex of British aristocracy. The Dukes of Devonshire have held vast estates since the 17th century: Chatsworth House in Derbyshire, Lismore Castle in Ireland, Bolton Abbey in Yorkshire, and a townhouse in London. They have intermarried with other great families, produced prime ministers and cabinet members, and moved through centuries of British history as fixtures of wealth and power. Billy Cavendish, at 20, is everything the system has designed him to be: charming, well-educated at Eton and Cambridge, comfortable in his status without arrogance, serious about the responsibilities that will one day come with his title. He is also, by all accounts, genuinely drawn to Kathleen's vitality and American directness, qualities that stand in refreshing contrast to the studied reserve of most women in his circle. Their courtship, conducted under the watchful eyes of both families and London society, proceeds through the approved channels: dances where they appear on each other's cards, weekend house parties where they are included in shooting parties and lawn games, carefully chaperoned afternoons where groups of young people gather for tennis or rowing on the Thames. The rustle of silk evening gowns on ballroom floors, the glow of gas lamps on rain-wet pavements, the rattle of carriage wheels and later motor cars in Hyde Park. These sounds become the sensory backdrop of Kathleen's education in love and social strategy, indistinguishable processes in the world she now inhabits. At the small writing desk in her bedroom, under the warm glow of a silk-shaded lamp, she composes letters that perform multiple functions simultaneously. To Jack, she describes Billy with carefully calibrated enthusiasm, enough to signal her interest, not so much as to suggest anything has been decided. To her parents, she mentions him among other friends, keeping the relationship casual in her reporting even as it deepens in reality. The narrator reflects that in these letters, the language of a debutante season and the vocabulary of serious affection are essentially indistinguishable, both filtered through the approved rhetoric of parties, impressions, and family pride. The letter itself becomes a tool of diplomacy, allowing Kathleen to pursue her own desires while maintaining the appearance of dutiful reporting to parental authority. By the summer of 1939, the glittering world of London seasons and country house weekends was collapsing under the weight of an international crisis. Hitler's forces occupied Czechoslovakia in March. Tensions with Poland are escalating. At embassy receptions and dinner parties, the conversation now turns constantly to war preparations, to the question of whether Britain can be defended, to the growing likelihood that the fragile peace will shatter completely. On 3rd September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. The transformation is immediate and total. The blackout begins that night. All windows covered, streetlights extinguished. The city plunged into darkness that makes even familiar streets dangerous. Air raid sirens are tested. Gas masks are distributed. Children are evacuated from London to the countryside. At Prince's Gate, the atmosphere shifts from diplomatic entertaining to crisis management. Joseph Kennedy, convinced that Britain cannot withstand a German assault and that American involvement would be disastrous, begins sending cables to Washington advocating for neutrality and warning against support for what he sees as a doomed cause. His defeatism, privately expressed to Roosevelt but increasingly apparent to his British hosts, begins to damage his effectiveness as ambassador. For Kathleen and her siblings, the war brings an end to the carefree existence they have enjoyed for 18 months. The embassy's social calendar evaporates. Friends leave London for military service or family estates. The season of balls and house parties gives way to something far more serious. Kathleen's scrapbook reflects the transformation. Where once there were embossed invitations and society clippings, now there are newspaper articles about air raids, official bulletins, programs from war charity events. The last entries from this period include photographs taken in the Prince's Gate garden, the Kennedy children arranged in a final group portrait before everything changes. On dim evenings during the first months of war, with blackout curtains drawn tight across the tall windows, Kathleen sits at her desk and writes letters to London friends who have dispersed to country houses or military postings. The warm glow of a shaded lamp falls on her hands as she works. Outside, the city is dark and mostly silent, except for the occasional distant thud of anti-aircraft guns during air raid alerts. The ritual of correspondence, once a pleasant social duty, becomes something more urgent, a way of maintaining connection across an uncertain future, of holding together through written words a world that is physically disintegrating. She writes to Billy, now training with the Coldstream Guards, to other friends preparing for war service, to relatives in America trying to understand what is happening in Europe. In the spring of 1940, as German forces sweep through the Netherlands and Belgium and begin their assault on France, it becomes clear that the Kennedy family will have to leave London. Joseph's ambassadorship, already compromised by his defeatist attitude, cannot survive the crisis. In September 1940, the family returned to the United States, leaving behind a London that was entering the Blitz. The Prince's Gate scrapbook closes with these final artifacts: boarding passes for the Atlantic crossing, farewell notes from friends, a last photograph in the garden with the house behind them, taken on a gray September afternoon when the future was completely unclear. Kathleen leaves behind not just a city, but a life she had been building, friendships that mattered deeply, and Billy Cavendish, whose Protestant faith and aristocratic responsibilities make any permanent commitment complicated even in peacetime, impossible to formalize across an ocean and a war. The narrator observes that the skills that made Kathleen a perfect hostess, the ability to remember names, to sustain conversations, to write witty and affectionate notes, must now serve a different purpose: maintaining connection across distance and uncertainty, preserving relationships that may not survive the war, writing letters that might be final without acknowledging that possibility. The last page of the scrapbook, now preserved behind archival glass at the Kennedy Library, shows a pressed flower, possibly from the Prince's Gate garden, though no notation explains its significance, and a handwritten caption in Kathleen's hand: London, September 1940. Nothing more. The flower and the date speak to something that cannot quite be put into acceptable words. Back in the United States in late 1940 and into 1941, Kathleen faces the challenge of readjusting to American life after 2 transformative years in London. The United States is still neutral, still debating whether to enter the European War, and the distance between American normalcy and British crisis makes her recent past feel almost unreal. She moves to Washington, D.C., where several of her college-age siblings have also gravitated, drawn by the energy of a capital city preparing, however reluctantly, for eventual involvement in the war. Washington in 1941 is a city transformed by mobilization, government agencies expanding rapidly, military personnel flooding in, a sense of urgency and purpose that contrasts sharply with the isolationist quietude of much of the country. Kathleen takes a job as a researcher at the Washington Times-Herald, one of several positions she will hold that are more about maintaining appropriate social activity than building a serious career. The Times-Herald, owned by Robert McCormick and edited by his cousin Eleanor Sissy Patterson, is an isolationist newspaper that often opposes Roosevelt's policies, an ironic choice for an ambassador's daughter, though perhaps an understandable one given her father's own views. More significantly, she shares an apartment with Inga Arvad, a glamorous Danish journalist whose past includes interviews with Hitler and friendships with Nazi officials, connections that have made her a person of intense interest to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Arvad, beautiful and sophisticated, represents everything Rose Kennedy would not choose for her daughter: a divorced Protestant with a complicated past, exactly the kind of woman who exists outside the boundaries of respectable Catholic society. The apartment they share is modest by Kennedy standards, a few rooms in a Washington building, furnished simply, nothing like the embassy elegance of Prince's Gate, but it offers something Kathleen has rarely experienced: genuine independence. Here, away from parental supervision, she and Inga live as working women, typing articles at the kitchen table under a bare bulb, their coffee cups leaving rings on the wood, radio news broadcasts providing constant background noise about the escalating war in Europe and the Pacific. The sensory details of this period, cigarette smoke hanging in small rooms, the clatter of typewriters, the smell of coffee perpetually brewing, the sound of reporters arguing about copy and deadlines, mark a distinct shift from the refined atmosphere of convents and embassies. This is a grittier, more immediate world, and Kathleen navigates it with the same social skills she brought to London drawing rooms, but now applied in a different register. It is through Kathleen that Inga Arvad meets John F. Kennedy, who is stationed in Washington with naval intelligence. The relationship between Jack and Inga, passionate, complicated, ultimately doomed by Inga's FBI file and the family's political concerns, will later be documented extensively in FBI surveillance reports, biographies, and historical studies. The fact that Kathleen facilitated this introduction, that she maintained her friendship with Inga despite family disapproval, suggests a willingness to operate outside prescribed boundaries that will characterize her own most important decisions. Kathleen's letters home from this period, some of which appear in Kennedy family collections and have been quoted in biographies, mention work, friends, dances, social events, maintaining the surface performance of dutiful reporting. But what they reveal, read carefully, is a young woman building a life not entirely under parental control, making choices about companions and activities based on her own judgment rather than family direction. The narrator observes that every envelope she addresses from that Washington apartment, every letter sent with its careful balance of disclosure and discretion, carries the same contradiction: a polite surface concealing a degree of independence that would be unacceptable if fully acknowledged. She is learning to live in the space between obedience and rebellion, maintaining family connection while building a self that does not entirely conform to family expectations. By late 1942, as the United States entered its first full year of war after Pearl Harbor and American forces deployed globally, Kathleen began exploring the possibility of returning to England, not as an ambassador's daughter this time, but as a war worker, a role that will give her both purpose and the chance to return to the world and the person she left behind. In June 1943, Kathleen Kennedy arrived back in London, this time wearing the uniform of the American Red Cross. She has managed this return through a combination of determination and strategic use of family connections, convincing the Red Cross to send her to Britain as a volunteer worker in their services for American troops stationed in England. The London she returns to is dramatically changed from the city she left in 1940. The Blitz has scarred entire neighborhoods. Bomb sites gap like missing teeth in once elegant streets. Rationing is severe. Luxury has become a memory. The population is exhausted from years of air raids, blackouts, and the constant tension of being a target. Yet there is also resilience and a grim humor that Kathleen finds moving and recognizable. The British determination to carry on properly that mirrors, in some ways, the Kennedy family's own emphasis on maintaining appearances regardless of private difficulty. She is stationed at Hans Crescent, working in a Red Cross club where American servicemen can get coffee, donuts, conversation, and a brief respite from military routine. Photographs from this period, preserved in various archives, show her in the gray-blue Red Cross uniform with its distinctive insignia. Her smile is broad and unguarded as in her debutante pictures, though now framed by the austerity of wartime Britain rather than embassy elegance. The work is entirely different from anything in her previous experience. She pours coffee in basement canteens, organizes dances in dim halls, writes letters home for wounded soldiers, distributes comfort packages, and performs the countless small services that the Red Cross provides. The sensory world of this work, the smell of coffee perpetually brewing, scratchy phonograph records playing big band music, cigarette smoke hanging in low-ceilinged rooms, the damp wool smell of military uniforms, becomes her daily environment. But more important than the work itself is what it allows. Kathleen is back in England, back among the friends, and in the landscape she has missed desperately during her exile in America. She writes to Jack, in a letter later, quoted in multiple biographies, that she is happier here than anywhere, expressing a love for England and for her London circle that goes beyond mere nostalgia to something like genuine belonging. She reconnects with Billy Cavendish, now a major in the Coldstream Guards. Their relationship, interrupted by 2 years of separation and the uncertainties of war, resumes with an intensity shaped by the knowledge that death could come at any moment. Billy is everything he was before, charming, serious about his duties, grounded in his aristocratic identity, but now also a combat veteran who has seen friends die and who carries the weight of leading men into battle. They meet when he has to leave in London, in the Red Cross Club, or at restaurants that still manage to serve meals despite rationing. In corners of dimly lit rooms, under the low lighting mandated by blackout regulations, they sit at small tables and talk about the war, about England, about the future that may or may not exist when the fighting ends. In one such corner on a damp evening in late 1943, with the air still carrying the faint, acrid smell of smoke from recent bombing and the wool of military uniforms releasing its damp sheep odor in the warmth, Kathleen sits writing a quick note to Billy at his unit. The Red Cross stationery is thin and cheap compared to the embossed embassy paper she once used. But the gesture is fundamentally the same, maintaining connection through carefully chosen words, creating intimacy across distance, using writing to build and sustain a relationship that faces enormous obstacles. The narrator reflects that Kathleen's ability to create warmth in cold rooms, to make exhausted servicemen feel welcomed and valued, to maintain grace under wartime conditions, makes her beloved among both American troops and her British friends. But it also makes her increasingly distinct from the cautious, carefully managed world of Kennedy propriety she came from. She is becoming her own person, making choices based on her own judgment, living a life that does not fit easily into the script her parents imagined for her. When she chooses to marry Billy Cavendish in the spring of 1944, that distinction will become not merely difference but rupture, a break that will never fully heal and that will shape the rest of her short life. By early 1944, with the Allied invasion of occupied Europe clearly imminent and Billy Cavendish facing deployment to France, the question of marriage became urgent. The relationship between Kathleen and Billy, resumed after her return to London, has deepened into genuine commitment, but it faces obstacles that in peacetime might have proven insurmountable. He is Protestant, she is Catholic, and both families have strong views about religious propriety. William Cavendish is not merely Protestant, but heir to a dukedom historically associated with the Church of England. The Devonshire family's vast estates include numerous Anglican churches, where the family has traditionally served as patrons. The Duke of Devonshire holds significant positions in the established church hierarchy. For Billy to marry a Catholic in a Catholic ceremony, agreeing to raise children Catholic, would be to repudiate centuries of family religious identity. For Kathleen, the situation is equally fraught. Rose Kennedy, whose own mother had once hoped Rose would become a nun, regards marriage to a Protestant, particularly without securing Catholic upbringing for future children, as a mortal sin. The Catholic Church's position is unambiguous. A mixed marriage outside the Church, without proper dispensation, and without commitment to Catholic education for children, places both parties outside the sacraments. Family correspondence from this period, preserved in the Kennedy archives at the JFK Library and in the Chatsworth estate papers, documents the increasingly desperate negotiations. Kathleen writes to her parents seeking their blessing, or at least their acceptance. Rose's replies, as quoted in later biographies, are uncompromising. Such a marriage would be a betrayal of faith and family. Joseph, more pragmatic but also concerned about political optics, urges delay and further negotiation. The Catholic Church is approached about dispensations. Could Kathleen marry in a Catholic ceremony if Billy agrees to certain conditions? Could children be raised with compromise between faiths? The answers, filtered through priests and canon lawyers, are discouraging. The Church will not easily sanction what it views as a dangerous precedent, and the Devonshire family will not agree to conditions that compromise Billy's position as future Duke. On a cold March evening in 1944, in a small London sitting room, still showing traces of blackout tape around the windows, and furnished with the threadbare gentility of wartime Britain, Kathleen sits at a desk composing parallel letters that represent the impossibility of her position. In one, written to Billy at his military posting, she expresses her love and her commitment, arguing that their relationship transcends the religious differences that families and churches insist matter above all else. In another written to her parents in Palm Beach, she tries to explain her decision in language they might accept, emphasizing her faith in God's understanding and her belief that true morality lies in following one's conscience rather than merely obeying external rules. The same pen, the same slanting hand that learned perfect thank you notes at her mother's direction, now carries two different arguments to two different audiences, trying to build bridges across an unbridgeable divide. The letters are models of careful rhetoric, never confrontational, always respectful, seeking understanding while asserting autonomy. But beneath the careful phrasing is a young woman making the most consequential decision of her life, choosing between her family's approval and her own sense of what will make her happy, between the script written for her and the life she wants to write for herself. The narrator observes that for a woman trained from childhood to smooth social differences, to write thank you notes that perfectly calibrate warmth and distance, to perform gratitude and deference on demand, this is the first time the surface cannot be made seamless. Any choice she makes will offend someone she loves. The skills that have served her so well, the ability to be charming to everyone, to make all parties feel valued, to navigate social complexity with grace, cannot solve this problem. Someone will be hurt, someone will be disappointed, and no amount of beautiful handwriting or perfect phrasing can prevent it. She chooses the marriage. In making that choice, she accepts the rupture with her mother that will never fully heal, and embraces, at least for a time, at least in the brief interval before tragedy intervenes, the possibility of joy. On 6th May 1944, in the Chelsea Register office on the King's Road in London, Kathleen Kennedy married William John Robert Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, in a brief civil ceremony. The choice of a civil ceremony, rather than a church wedding, represents the compromise that allows the marriage to happen at all. It satisfies neither the Catholic Church nor the Church of England, but it permits both families to avoid the more serious scandal of an explicitly interfaith religious ceremony. The ceremony itself lasts only 7 minutes. Present are Billy's parents, the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, representing the Cavendish family's acceptance of the match despite its religious complications, and Kathleen's brother Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., on leave from his duties as a naval aviator. Joe Jr. is the only Kennedy present, the only family member willing to cross Rose's prohibition on attendance. A photograph from the day, preserved both in Kennedy family archives and in the Chatsworth collection, shows Kathleen in a simple pink suit with a small hat, her smile mixing nerves and delight. She carries a small bouquet. Billy stands beside her in his Coldstream Guards uniform. They look impossibly young and hopeful, standing in a registration office rather than a grand church, surrounded by only a handful of witnesses, beginning a marriage that will last less than 4 months. Immediately after the ceremony, the couple walk down the King's Road in light spring rain, the wet pavement reflecting gray London light. The sound of traffic mixes with distant air raid sirens, a reminder that they are marrying in the middle of a war, that Billy will deploy to France within weeks, that nothing about their future is certain. That evening, from a small hotel room where they spend their wedding night before traveling to Eastbourne for a brief honeymoon, Kathleen writes a long letter to her parents. The letter, portions of which have been quoted in biographies, attempts to bridge the distance between their outrage and her happiness to make them understand that her choice was made from love and faith rather than rebellion or disrespect. She emphasizes her continued commitment to Catholicism, her belief that God understands the sincerity of her intentions, her hope that time will heal the breach. The letter is careful, affectionate, seeking reconciliation without apology. Another example of her lifelong training in managing social relationships through perfect phrasing, though this time the stakes are infinitely higher than thank you notes after tea parties. From the perspective of aristocratic strategy, the marriage is momentous. An American ambassador's daughter is now in line to become Duchess of Devonshire, a fusion of American political ambition and British landed power that represents exactly the kind of transatlantic alliance that families like the Kennedys and Cavendishes have been negotiating for generations. If Billy survives the war and inherits the dukedom, Kathleen will become one of the grandest ladies in England, Chatelaine of Chatsworth and the other Devonshire estates, a hostess of political significance. But this strategic reading, which both families undoubtedly consider, coexists uneasily with the genuine affection between Kathleen and Billy, documented in their letters and in the testimony of friends. They are not merely making an advantageous match, they love each other, a fact that complicates the cold calculus of dynasty and makes the tragedy that follows genuinely heartbreaking rather than merely politically significant. The narrator reflects that the marriage is simultaneously an assertion of Kathleen's own will, her refusal to let religious doctrine prevent her happiness, and an extension of the old architecture of alliance that has shaped her entire life. In choosing Billy, she is both rebelling against her parents' specific wishes and fulfilling their broader ambition to place their children in positions of maximum social advantage. The contradiction is not lost on anyone involved. After a honeymoon of only a few days in Eastbourne, a seaside town where blackout restrictions and wartime austerity make everything feel provisional and strange, Billy returns to his unit to prepare for the invasion of France. The war, which has been the constant background to their relationship, now moves to the foreground. Within weeks, he will be in combat. The marriage has happened. The rupture with Rose is complete, and the brief interval of happiness is already ending before it has properly begun. The letters Kathleen writes and receives during this period, preserved in multiple archives, carry the weight of that knowledge. Joy and foreboding inseparable, every moment together shadowed by the certainty of separation and the possibility that separation will become permanent. After the wedding, Billy returns almost immediately to his regiment. The Coldstream Guards are preparing for Operation Overlord, the massive Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France scheduled for early June. By the time the invasion begins on 6th of June 1944, he is in France with his company, leading men through the complex and deadly operations of the Normandy campaign. Kathleen remains in London, continuing her Red Cross work and waiting for letters that arrive irregularly through military post. During the brief intervals when Billy has leave and can return to England, they spend time at Eastbourne or at the Devonshire family properties. Chatsworth in Derbyshire, with its vast house and grounds, and the smaller house at Edensor, the estate village. They keep a joint diary during these visits, an intimate document recording the strange mixture of domestic peace and wartime anxiety that characterizes their marriage. The diary, later quoted in accounts of their relationship, describes walks through Chatsworth's grounds, quiet dinners, the ordinary pleasures of being together. But it also contains the rueful observation, in Kathleen's hand, that their love affair seems to cause nothing but goodbyes. In total, between their wedding on 6 May and Billy's death 4 months later, they spend perhaps 5 or 6 weeks actually together. The rest is separation, letter writing, waiting, the constant low-level anxiety of knowing that every goodbye might be final. Kathleen's letters from this period, some preserved in the Chatsworth archives, attempt to maintain normalcy through cheerful reporting and affectionate endearments, but the underlying fear is palpable to anyone reading them decades later. Fear that each letter might be the last, that the fragile happiness they have built might be destroyed before it has time to take root and grow into something more substantial than a brief wartime romance. On 9th September 1944, near the Belgian village of Heppen, Major William Cavendish was killed by a German sniper while leading his company forward during operations to secure the area. He is 26 years old. The circumstances of his death, not in some dramatic charge or final stand, but in the ordinary chaos of combat, one among thousands of British officers killed in the war, make it no less devastating for being commonplace. The telegram reaches Kathleen in London on a gray morning. She is at the Hans Crescent Red Cross Club, performing the routine duties that have structured her days. An official messenger arrives. She is called to the office. The telegram is handed to her. The building around her is quiet except for the usual sounds of wartime London. Distant traffic, the low murmur of servicemen in the canteen, the tick of a clock on the wall. She reads it. The words are formal, brief, offering condolences and notification of death in action. No details, no explanation beyond the bare fact. Billy is dead, killed in Belgium, buried near where he fell. On a desk nearby lies a letter she has been writing to him, the ink not yet dry, full of trivial news and affectionate phrases, now transformed instantly into an artifact from a past that ended sometime in the last several days, but that she has only just learned about. The letter will never be posted. It will be preserved instead, along with the telegram, in the archive of a marriage that lasted 4 months and produced no children, no heirs, nothing but memory and grief. Billy is buried initially near Heppen, later reinterred with other war dead in a Commonwealth cemetery. Kathleen Kennedy, at 24, becomes the Dowager Marchioness of Hartington, a title that acknowledges her brief marriage and carries significant social standing, but that is fundamentally defined by loss. She is a widow, without children, still young, her life disrupted but not yet over, facing the question of what comes next when the future she had imagined has been destroyed. The narrator observes that for a woman trained to manage appearances, to smooth social surfaces, to write perfect letters of gratitude and condolence, widowhood offers no script that can adequately contain genuine grief. Black crape and formal mourning customs, the proper letters of condolence and sympathy, the rituals of aristocratic bereavement, all of these can only cover, not fill, the sudden hollow at the center of her life. She has broken with her family for this marriage, has chosen Billy over her mother's approval and the security of remaining within Catholic orthodoxy. And now Billy is gone, and she is left in England, connected to his family but not quite part of them, estranged from her own family, occupying a social position, Dowager Marchioness, that simultaneously acknowledges her brief entrance into the highest reaches of British aristocracy and marks her as someone whose primary identity is defined by what she has lost. In the void that follows, the habits of companionship and the willingness to take risks that brought her to this point will draw her toward another man, this time from even further beyond the boundaries of acceptable choice. In the 2 years following Billy's death, Kathleen remains in England rather than returning to the United States. She moves between London, where she maintains a small flat, and country houses where she is welcomed as a widow connected to the Devonshire family, and as a personality in her own right, popular among the diminished but still functioning British aristocracy. Post-war Britain is a place of profound social transformation. The Labour government elected in 1945 is implementing policies that will fundamentally alter the aristocratic world Kathleen has married into, nationalizing industries, expanding social welfare, increasing taxes on inherited wealth. The great country houses that survived the war face an uncertain future. Many will be demolished, others given to the National Trust, others open to tourists to pay for their upkeep. Yet in the immediate aftermath of war, there is also a desperate gaiety among survivors, a sense that life must be lived fully precisely because so many did not survive. London society in 1946-1947 combines continued austerity. Rationing will last until the 1950s, with the renewal of the social season, parties, weekends at country houses, the rituals of a class determined to maintain itself despite everything working against it. It is in this context that Kathleen grows close to Peter Wentworth Fitzwilliam, 8th Earl Fitzwilliam. The Fitzwilliam family, like the Cavendishes, represents Old English wealth and title, vast estates in Yorkshire and Ireland, a lineage stretching back centuries, enormous inherited wealth from coal mining on their lands. Peter Fitzwilliam, at 37, is charming, handsome, reckless with money, and trapped in a disastrous marriage to an alcoholic wife whom he is in the process of divorcing. Friends compare Fitzwilliam to Rhett Butler from Gone with the Wind, a comparison that appears in multiple contemporary accounts and later biographies, suggesting a dashing but morally ambiguous figure. Attractive precisely because he does not conform to conventional aristocratic propriety. He drinks heavily, gambles, spends money with careless extravagance, and has a reputation for romantic affairs. He is, in other words, exactly the kind of man Rose Kennedy would find horrifying, and Kathleen, perhaps partly for that reason, finds it compelling. Their relationship, documented in letters preserved at Chatsworth and in Kennedy family papers, develops gradually from friendship to romance. By 1947, it has become serious enough that Fitzwilliam is pursuing a divorce from his wife, and Kathleen is contemplating a second marriage. This proposed marriage presents even greater obstacles than her marriage to Billy Cavendish. Billy was Protestant but had never been married. The religious issue was significant but negotiable. Peter Fitzwilliam is Protestant, dissolute in his personal life, and seeking divorce, a combination that places any marriage to him not merely outside Catholic orthodoxy, but firmly in the category of mortal sin. The Catholic Church's position on divorce is absolute. A divorced person who remarries is committing adultery. A previous marriage remains valid in the eyes of God regardless of civil law, and any Catholic who participates in such an arrangement is damned. When Kathleen informs her parents of her intention to marry Fitzwilliam once his divorce is finalized, Rose's response, according to letters and later family accounts, is immediate and uncompromising. Proceed with this marriage, and you are no longer my daughter. Joseph, always more pragmatic, focuses on the political damage. How can a family with presidential ambitions for Jack explain a daughter who has married a divorced Protestant playboy? Correspondence from this period, quoted in multiple biographies, including works by Lynn McTaggart and Paula Byrne, shows Kathleen trying to defend her choice in terms her parents might accept. She emphasizes Fitzwilliam's good qualities, his love for her belief that she deserves happiness after Billy's death, but the fundamental incompatibility between her desires and her family's values cannot be bridged by rhetoric, however carefully phrased. In May 1948, Kathleen and Peter traveled to Paris, planning to fly onto the French Riviera where Joseph Kennedy was vacationing. The intention is to meet with her father face to face to make the case for the marriage in person, to somehow convince him, if not to approve, then at least not to permanently sever ties. On the morning of 13th of May, 1948, they boarded a de Havilland Dove, a small passenger aircraft, at Orly Airport outside Paris for the flight south. The weather is poor, heavy clouds, turbulence, conditions that would normally lead to flight cancellation, but Fitzwilliam, eager to reach Cannes, urges the pilot to proceed. The plane takes off into deteriorating weather. Kathleen sits in the narrow cabin, her leather bag beside her containing the half-finished letter to her father, trying to compose arguments that might bridge the unbridgeable. Opposite her, Fitzwilliam reviews documents related to his divorce and their future plans, papers that, like her letter, will never reach their intended recipients. The narrator observes that the meeting with her father never happens, that the last argument about love, duty, and appearance is silenced not by reconciliation or continued estrangement, but by physics and chance and bad weather over the Ardèche. Near the Plateau du Quaron, in the Ardèche region of southern France, approximately 30 kilometers from Privas, the de Havilland Dove encounters severe turbulence. The aircraft, flying through heavy weather at relatively low altitude, is caught in conditions that exceed its structural tolerances. The violence of the turbulence tears off the right wing, then both engines, then the tail section. The fuselage, now just a broken cylinder containing 4 people, falls nose first into a ravine near the village of Sambozil. All 4 occupants, Kathleen Kennedy, Peter Fitzwilliam, the pilot, and the co-pilot, are killed instantly on impact. The crash site is remote. The wreckage is not discovered until the following day when search parties locate it. By the time rescuers reach the site, there is nothing to be done except recover the bodies and begin the process of notification and investigation. The Aviation Safety Network's records, cited in multiple accounts of the crash, document the mechanical failure caused by severe turbulence. The investigation concludes that the pilot should not have flown in such conditions, that the decision to proceed represented poor judgment, but that once airborne in those weather conditions, the structural failure was likely inevitable. Joseph Kennedy, waiting at his hotel on the Riviera, learns of his daughter's death through a phone call on the afternoon of 14 May. The meeting that was supposed to happen, the argument and negotiation and possible reconciliation, has been rendered permanently impossible. Whatever he might have said to Kathleen, whatever compromise or ultimatum he was preparing, remains forever unexpressed. In the United States, Rose Kennedy learns of her daughter's death through a call from Joseph. Her response, according to later family accounts, is complicated by the fact that Kathleen died while traveling with a man Rose viewed as morally unacceptable, en route to a meeting that was meant to discuss a marriage Rose had explicitly forbidden. The grief is real, but it is entangled with religious conviction and maternal anger in ways that make simple mourning impossible. The body is transported back to England, where the Devonshire family arranges for funeral services. Joseph Kennedy flies to London, representing the family, but Rose, citing health concerns, does not attend. None of Kathleen's siblings are present. The funeral mass is held at Farm Street Church in London, the main Jesuit church, before burial. On a gray English afternoon in May 1948, Kathleen Kennedy is buried at St. Peter's Church, Edensor, in the Cavendish family churchyard near Chatsworth. The churchyard, surrounded by ancient yews and stone walls, contains graves dating back centuries, dukes and duchesses, children who died young, family members who died in wars. Her grave is marked by a simple headstone, installed later, bearing the inscription, "Joy she gave, joy she has found." The stone lies among those of Billy's ancestors, and will eventually lie near his parents and other Cavendishes. The location itself represents a choice. She is buried as a member of the Cavendish family, not the Kennedy family, in an Anglican churchyard rather than Catholic ground. The burial is Protestant, conducted according to Church of England rites, completing her break with Catholic orthodoxy that began with her marriage to Billy and that her mother never forgave. The Derbyshire wind moves through the churchyard trees. The bells of St. Peter's ring, as they have for centuries, marking hours and holy days, indifferent to the particular grief of any moment. The narrator observes that the daughter whose choices once threatened the family image is now buried far from her family, in a country she chose over theirs, in ground that represents her defiance and her exile. For more than a decade afterward, the grave is rarely mentioned publicly in the Kennedy family, as John F. Kennedy rises in politics, first to the Senate and then toward the presidency. Family narratives emphasize vigor, achievement, unity, and Catholic devotion. Kathleen, whose story contradicts all of these themes, becomes a kind of silence in the family mythology, remembered privately perhaps, but not acknowledged in the public performances of Kennedy identity. Then, on 29 June 1963, during a European tour that included Berlin and Ireland, President John F. Kennedy quietly detoured to Chatsworth. He visits Kathleen's grave, leaving flowers, standing alone for several minutes in the Edensor churchyard, while Secret Service agents wait at a respectful distance. Later, he writes to the Duchess of Devonshire about the visit, expressing gratitude for the Cavendish family's care of his sister's memory. A tablet is later installed in the churchyard, recording his visit, making it part of the site's historical significance. The narrator reflects that the daughter whose choices once threatened family reputation becomes, in death, the site of private pilgrimage for a brother marked by his own burdens of performance, JFK, whose presidency requires constant performance of vitality and control, whose private life is carefully concealed behind public image, whose own relationship with Catholic doctrine is complicated by pragmatism and desire, perhaps finds in Kathleen's grave a reminder of the cost of choosing personal happiness over family expectation, of the price paid by those who refuse to subordinate self to dynasty. 4 months after that visit, JFK himself will be dead, buried at Arlington, rather than in the Kennedy family plot in Massachusetts, his grave also becoming a place of pilgrimage and public memory. But in June 1963, he stands in an English churchyard reading the words on his sister's stone, "Joy she gave, joy she has found," and whatever he thinks remains private, unrecorded, part of the vast territory of human emotion that no amount of documentary research can fully recover. From the 1960s onward, historians and biographers gradually recovered Kathleen Kennedy's story from the silence that surrounded it during the 1950s. Eunice Kennedy Shriver and other siblings begin speaking about her with affection in interviews, emphasizing her warmth, charm, and the tragedy of her early death. But the full complexity of her story, the religious conflicts, the break with Rose, the relationship with Fitzwilliam, emerges more slowly as archives become available and family members grow willing to discuss difficult subjects. Lynn McTaggart's 1983 biography, Kathleen Kennedy, Her Life and Times, draws on interviews with Kathleen's friends and surviving family members, presenting her as a woman caught between two worlds: the strict Catholic propriety of her mother and the more permissive atmosphere of British aristocracy. Paula Byrne's 2016 book, Kick, The True Story of JFK's Sister and the Heir to Chatsworth, uses letters, diaries, and estate papers to reconstruct the relationship with Billy Cavendish in detail, portraying a genuine love affair, rather than merely a strategic marriage. The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library's holdings include Kathleen's scrapbook from 1938-1940, a document that has become central to understanding her London period. The scrapbook, carefully preserved and now digitized, contains invitations embossed with aristocratic crests, programs from balls and theater performances, newspaper clippings about embassy events, photographs of her with friends, pressed flowers, handwritten notes. Each page represents a moment in time, a social event attended, a friendship maintained, evidence of a life lived fully in the brief interval between girlhood and tragedy. Chatsworth House, open to the public as one of Britain's grandest stately homes, includes displays about Kathleen in its historical exhibitions. Visitors walking through the staterooms and galleries, viewing centuries of Cavendish family history, encounter her story as part of that narrative. The American ambassador's daughter who married the heir became a widow after 4 months and is buried in the estate village churchyard. Articles in Irish and British newspapers, particularly around anniversaries of her death or the publication of new biographies, present her as the forgotten Kennedy or the free-spirited sister, a woman who loved England, challenged Catholic strictures about marriage, and paid with her life and posthumous exclusion from family mythology. The framing is often romantic, emphasizing her defiance and independence, sometimes oversimplifying the genuine conflict between her desires and her religious upbringing. Her image appears in exhibitions and documentaries alongside the artifacts that documented her life, invitations to embassy receptions, her Red Cross uniform, photographs from her wedding day, letters to and from Billy Cavendish. Each artifact is a fragment of a life lived in motion, preserved now in archival stillness, available for interpretation by visitors and researchers who try to understand not just what happened, but what it meant. In a museum reading room today, or in the online archives that have made such materials widely accessible, a researcher opens a digital scan of Kathleen's 1938-1940 scrapbook. The pages, photographed in high resolution, show the texture of old paper, the slight discoloration of age, the glue stains where she attached clippings and programs. Under each pasted item is the faint shadow of adhesive applied decades ago by Kathleen herself, sitting at her desk at Prince's Gate, curating her own story. This, too, the narrator observes, is a kind of letter, written not in words but in ephemera, a visual and tactile record of a world and a self she was creating. Like her thank you notes and her letters to family, the scrapbook is both documentary evidence and performance, both genuine expression and strategic self-presentation. It shows what she wanted to remember and what she wanted others to see. Herself at the center of London society, connected, beloved, perfectly at ease. What it cannot show, what perhaps no archive can fully capture, is the cost of that performance, the effort required to be charming to everyone, the tension between who she felt herself to be and who her family expected her to become. The scrapbook records triumphs. It does not record the nights when the performance felt impossible, the moments of doubt or fear or loneliness that leave no physical trace. The narrator reflects that the same culture that once disciplined Kathleen into a perfect hostess, that trained her to write flawless thank you notes and perform gratitude on demand, now depends on her preserved traces to tell a more complicated truth about obedience and choice. She has become, in death and in archival afterlife, an argument about autonomy and constraint, about what women of her class and generation were allowed to want and what they had to sacrifice to pursue their desires. The story told about her has changed over time, shaped by the evolving concerns of those doing the telling. In the 1950s and early 1960s, she was barely mentioned. In the 1970s and 1980s, a second-wave feminism reframed questions of women's autonomy. She became a figure of proto-feminist defiance. In recent decades, as archives have opened and new biographies have appeared, the story has grown more nuanced, less a simple tale of rebellion than a complex portrait of someone trying to live fully inside an architecture not built to accommodate her particular combination of desires and loyalties. What remains, beyond all the interpretations and reframing, is the archive itself, the letters, the scrapbook, the photographs, the grave in Edensor churchyard. These fragments outlast the life they document, speaking in their mute, material way to anyone willing to pay attention. They do not resolve into a single meaning or moral. They simply exist, evidence of a life lived, choices made, consequences endured. The portrait that emerges is not a morality tale of rebellion punished or duty betrayed, but a layered human account of how one woman tried to navigate between love and obligation, between personal happiness and family loyalty, between the life she was supposed to live and the life she wanted, that she failed to find a sustainable balance, that she died young while attempting yet another negotiation of impossible contradictions, does not diminish the attempt itself. In the end, we return to two images connected by paper and the particular silence that surrounds preserved documents. In the first image, drawn from a photograph preserved in Kennedy family collections at the JFK Library, Kathleen sits at her writing desk in her bedroom at 14 Prince's Gate in the spring of 1938. The late afternoon light falls through tall windows, softened by lace curtains, illuminating her bent head and the hand that moves across embossed stationery. She is writing another thank you note, perhaps, or a letter to a friend, or one of the many small acts of correspondence that constitute the social glue of her world. The photograph captures her in profile, the neat curve of her bobbed hair, the concentration in her posture, the casual elegance of someone performing a familiar task. She looks young, confident, perfectly at ease in her role as ambassador's daughter, debutante, emerging personality in London society. The desk holds the implements of her craft: fountain pen, blotter, neat stack of stationery, perhaps a small address book with the names and addresses of everyone who matters. The image represents a moment of complete integration between self and role, when what she is expected to be and what she wants to be exist in apparent harmony. The letter she is writing will be witty, charming, perfectly pitched to its recipient. Another small performance of the grace that makes her beloved in London drawing rooms. In the second image, a visitor stands in the churchyard of St. Peter's, Edensor, on a quiet afternoon. The ancient church sits among yew trees and stone walls, surrounded by Cavendish graves dating back centuries. The visitor reads the inscription on Kathleen's headstone: "Joy she gave, joy she has found, and then looks down at a small museum information plaque that has been installed nearby, explaining who she was. Daughter of American ambassador, Marchioness of Hartington, died in plane crash 1948, visited by President Kennedy 1963. The words on the stone, chosen by the Cavendish family, emphasize her warmth and generosity, her capacity to create joy in others. They are affectionate, respectful, and true in their way, but they are also necessarily incomplete. They do not mention the break with her mother, the religious conflicts that shaped her choices, the complicated relationship with Fitzwilliam that led to the flight that killed her. They present joy as her legacy, omitting the cost at which that joy was achieved and maintained. The Derbyshire wind moved through the churchyard, rustling leaves and bringing the smell of rain from distant hills. The bells of St. Peter's mark the hour. The grave itself is modest, appropriate to someone who died young rather than after a long life of achievement and accumulation. It sits among more elaborate monuments to dukes and duchesses, a simple stone marker in a crowded field of aristocratic memory. Between these two images, the young woman writing at her desk in London, the grave in an English churchyard, lie all the letters she wrote and all the conversations she never had. The gloves she wore to embassy receptions, the dance cards she filled with penciled names, the folded pages of correspondence that maintained relationships and negotiated impossible loyalties. All of these were tools of grace, instruments of social navigation, and also, necessarily, tools of constraint. She learned to write perfect thank you notes before she learned to ask what she herself wanted. She learned to charm everyone before she learned to insist on her own needs. She learned to smooth social surfaces before she understood that some conflicts cannot be smoothed away, that some choices require accepting permanent rupture rather than maintaining pleasant facades. The skills that made her successful, the warmth, the wit, the ability to make everyone feel valued, could not solve the fundamental incompatibility between her desires and her family's expectations. No amount of careful phrasing could bridge the gap between Catholic doctrine and her love for Protestant men. No thank you note, however beautifully written, could reconcile her mother to choices Rose viewed as mortal sins. The narrator offers no verdict on whether Kathleen made the right choices. The archive does not support simple judgments. She loved Billy Cavendish genuinely. She broke with her family genuinely. She died genuinely happy by all accounts, in a relationship her mother considered damnable. These facts coexist without resolving into a clear moral. What remains is the portrait itself, now hanging in our collective gallery of historical figures we used to think about autonomy, constraint, class, and gender. The portrait's surface is still beautiful. The scrapbook pages, the wedding photographs, the testimonies of friends about her charm and warmth all preserve that beauty. But the shadows are finally acknowledged. The cost of performance, the weight of expectation, the impossibility of being simultaneously dutiful daughter and autonomous self in a world structured around the assumption that women exist to serve family interests rather than pursue personal happiness. The archive speaks in fragments, in preserved letters and photographs and diary entries, in the material traces of a life that was cut short before it could fully unfold. We interpret these fragments, construct narratives, try to understand what she felt and wanted and sacrificed. But the fragments resist complete interpretation. They remain partial, suggestive, open to multiple readings. A visitor in the Edensor churchyard, having read the inscription and the historical marker, might stand for a moment in silence, considering the distance between joy she gave, joy she has found, and the more complicated truth preserved in archives and biographies. Then the visitor moves on, walking between ancient graves toward the church or back toward Chatsworth, leaving Kathleen to her rest among the Cavendishes, who accepted her more fully than her own family did. The portrait remains, the letters remain, the grave remains, and the question they collectively pose about the price of grace, about what it costs to perform perfect femininity in a world that demands performance while punishing those who take their performances too seriously and act on desires that exceed their prescribed roles. That question remains open, relevant, unresolved. The gloves are preserved in museum storage. The letters are preserved in archives. The woman who wore the gloves and wrote the letters is preserved only in memory and in the stories we construct from her traces. Stories that reveal as much about us, about what we need her to have been, as they do about who she actually was.